Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the way the Minister finished the speech showed the somewhat unfortunate trend for the Greens to use more and more extreme language as they try and compete with the Labor Party for the left-wing vote. And it is getting harder for the Greens, no doubt about that. Mr Cunliffe's doing a better job of competing for that vote than his predecessor. But for a party who came into Parliament to raise standards, the vicious and vindictive nature of the Greens' language, I'd have to say, is not something that the Labor Party do that often, on the same personal way that the Greens do. Mr Speaker, Mr Banks resigned yesterday, consistent with an undertaking he had made that if the District Court decision was that he would go further down the legal process, then he would resign as a minister, and that is appropriate. A couple of issues have been raised by the previous member and by the opposition during question time, which I think need to be commented on. One is simply that in the manner of any New Zealand citizen, Mr Banks will go into a legal process where the process assumes innocence until proven guilty. The eagerness of the opposition to jump to conclusions about the results of that process, I think, don't really show respect for it. The Greens have raised the issue of how a member here, Mr Banks, might exercise his vote, having resigned as a minister. Well, it's not up to the government to determine how people exercise their vote. It is a right of a member of Parliament to exercise. Well, actually, Philip Field exercised his vote. He voted against the Labor Party on some of the issues to which he was opposed to. And I expect that Mr Banks will do the same. He'll exercise his vote as he sees fit. By our constitutional arrangements, he's a member of Parliament. It's entirely up to him to exercise that vote. And as for the opposition contention that there's somehow lack of stability in the government, I would invite them, as I did in the answer to questions, to have a look at the confidence and supply agreements that the John Key-led national government has in place. In fact, the majority of the government has increased in recent weeks because Leanne Dalziel has resigned from Parliament, and we've yet to see the results of a by-election in Christchurch East. Who knows, the government's majority might increase as a result of that. You just don't know. So the suggestion that somehow the government is propped up by anyone is simply wrong. I also want to address one or two issues that the member for the Greens actually raised, and one of them, which I thought was quite out of order, was the assertion that the government was somehow failing day by day. When the economy is growing, when employment in the regions is picking up, when it's pretty clear that in every region, despite the recession, the economy grew, the numbers grew in all except one, that's Gisborne. When we see today reports that in the South Island job vacancies are booming, that's not a sign of a failing economy or of a failing government. But I'd also invite the member from the Greens who decided to focus not so much on the capacities of Mr Banks but on the capacities of other ministers to look a bit more closely at the policy. In fact, I'd invite the Greens to think pretty hard about their own conscience. And with respect to education, both the previous minister and the current minister have done more than any Green Labor government did to provide to focus on those who most need the benefits of public education, who most needs the benefits of public education. And the Greens have opposed every single policy which is going about the difficult task of providing for those who most need the opportunity of a good education, a better opportunity. And we will stand by that, whatever ministerial resignations there are. So, Mr Speaker, to come back to Mr Banks, he has performed his duties as a minister. with consistency. He has stuck to the confidence and supply agreement. I have dealt with him over regulatory issues. They're complex. The Labor Party just agrees in more and more regulation. Mr Banks doesn't. He agrees with sensible regulation, and we've worked quite hard, actually, to create a regulatory system create a regulatory system that deals with the issues of costs and benefits in an even-handed and transparent way. And in fact, it would be, among governments across the world, one of the more progressive approaches to regulation that is evident. As for small business, John Banks was a strong advocate for things like the 90-day trial period, which encourage employment in small business. The Labor opposition opposed that. They oppose small businesses being able to negotiate to set their own wages. They want the living wage for all small businesses, particularly in retail and in those who service government. John Banks stood by those businesses. So, Mr Speaker, it is of some regret to the government that he has resigned as a minister, because he carried out his duties faithfully. Sometimes differences of opinion with the government, but nevertheless he stuck to advocating for those groups for who would expect a minister in that portfolio to advocate. And now he will deal, as any New Zealand citizen does who faces an allegation of lawful or unlawful behaviour. He will have to go through the legal process. He's outlined his own position about that, but it is appropriate that he ceases to function as a minister while that's underway.
I call the